So today with us, we have Saima Fancy from Ontario Health. Saima has over 20 years of experience spanning both in privacy, but in other fields as well. I'm really excited to hear her talk today about data minimization and pseudonymization, which are things that we've been talking about in some of the privacy classes here, but it'd be good to see kind of how they're applied in practice and what are kind of the challenges that are associated with these techniques. So I will pass it off to Saima.
Hi, thank you all. Thank you, Hannah. Really appreciate the intro. My name is, Saima Fancy. I'm a privacy engineer. Currently, I'm working out of Ontario Health in Toronto, Canada. I'm working in the intersection of engineering, privacy, data governance, and legal. And we're managing everything to do with health data. As you know, in Canada, healthcare is under the management of the government, hence all the data arrives on our platform, and we are tasked to manage it from a privacy, cybersecurity, data governance perspective, keeping in mind that we need to comply with laws within the Canadian jurisdiction. So that's why I decided to talk to you a little bit about, after discussing with Hannah, about driving data minimization and why that's such an important principle in the practice of data privacy and data governance, also data security as well. So as we know, data is ubiquitous in our societies, in our corporations. Everywhere we go, we're touching it, we're holding it in our hands with our phones. We're providing it freely, unknowingly sometimes with consent in place. So what is happening behind the scenes? As we know, there are a lot of concerns as to how our data is being used. And what are corporations doing about it in terms of being mindful in responsibly handling data, especially with the onset of artificial intelligence, which I'll get into in a bit. But first and foremost, let's be philosophical about this, shall we? Why should we be doing this? So the United Nations came out with a resolution some time ago, and they defined your right to privacy as a human right. The human right to privacy affirms that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his or her privacy, family, home, or correspondence, and the right to the protection of the law against such interference, and recognizes that the exercise of the right to privacy is important for the realization of the right to freedom of expression and to hold opinions without interferences, and is one of the foundations of a democratic society. Hence, we are here today recognizing as a right of yours, a right that needs to be guarded, that needs to be protected. As a result, we have, so happy to say, so many important laws and regulations evolving around the world, GDPR being the golden standard, setting precedents all over the world. And so, as you know, technology is all around us. Artificial intelligence is essentially perpetuating it at a rapid speed. We're at warp speed right now. And the way AI LLMs specifically work is with corpus amount of data. The tool cannot be optimized if it doesn't have a lot of data to drive it and to give us the insights that we're looking for. And it's that data that we are looking to protect. And the protection, one way, can be exacted via minimization. And what does that exactly mean? Firstly, we need to recognize the sources of data that are being fed into different systems around the world. We've got decentralized data, we've got Internet of Things, and that's rampant just in our households. If you look, we have our cell phones, our laptops, our tablets, our smart fridges, our smart appliances, our security systems. Everything is connected, and those of us who connect together are allowing this amount of data to flow in through one network, through one system, and that alone produces a lot of risk for us, both on the edge and on the networks itself. Then there's smart cities rolling out around the world. Saudi Arabia has a huge initiative with the Neon City, for example, that's being built as we speak outside of Riyadh and Jeddah. It's a phenomenal project. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but everything in that city is going to be smart, quote unquote, in the sense that there are sensors everywhere controlling from the air quality to the amount of humidity to noise to light. So all that data is being gathered, analyzed, and then the outputs are used to maintain the environment of that city. In Canada, in Toronto, we tried to build a smart city along Lake Ontario, and it fell through pretty badly because the citizens of Toronto were very concerned about their privacy. So just give you an idea where it can work in other parts of the world where it is cannot work versus it can work. And then there's of course health tech wearables. I mean, how many of us wear our Aura rings or our smart watches, even our clothing now? You know, Lululemon's coming out with wearables embedded into yoga pants and shirts and whatnot to optimize, to give us optimal data as to, you know, what's our heart rate like, how much did we sleep, are we breathing properly and whatnot? And where's all that data going? I mean, once you use it, you're essentially consenting for that data to be collected by the vendor who you purchased your gadgets from, or actually by the manufacturer, and then they're using that for their analytics purposes. So awareness is key to the employment of data. And here are some sectors that I talk about a little bit just to appreciate the corpus amount of data that we are flowing into various systems, from our banks to our healthcare facilities to social media. You know, when you're purchasing online, when you are liking a post on LinkedIn or on X, or wherever you are on Instagram and whatnot, when you're traveling. I mean, during COVID times, a lot of governments collected geolocation data to understand how and where people were traveling, especially if they were carrying COVID. So a lot of healthcare facilities were purchasing that data from telecommunication companies to monitor us and to monitor our traveling patterns. So that really drove surveillance. And I think a lot of people arguably seemingly would say that surveillance economy essentially exponentially grew during the COVID times. And that data was just being fed every which way, down to developing autonomous vehicles also. So that brings us to what can we do about all this data? For those of us who are practicing in privacy, and I should tell you, and I didn't do this properly, was when I was introducing myself, I should tell you that I'm a chemical engineer and a biochemist by profession, by academia here from University of Toronto, and I've done a whole bunch of certifications in privacy, cybersecurity, including the privacy engineering certification offered by Carnegie Mellon University. And one of the things that we discussed quite a bit in these certifications, and what I practice also, is the practice of data minimization to reduce the amount of data to be used, to be analyzed within industry at large. So one of the principles of OECD and GDPR and a lot of regulations around the world and legislation is use what you need for the singular purpose only. And then once you're done with it, discard it. And ideally, if you're using it, see if you can do it such that that data can't be re-identified. Hence, data minimization is such an important force in that practice. So essentially, data minimization is the reduction of the use of that data, retention of that data, such that it can be processed in the minimalist of ways, but not to compromise utility. It's a tricky one, isn't it? How do you minimize data and try to gather enough analytics from it? So say, for example, if you are in healthcare settings and you want to plan for the next pandemic, which will come, it's not going to be an if, but it's a when. How do you do that without working with a huge corpus of data, right? There are different techniques that can be used in industry that I'll talk about in a bit to do that. And how much data can you retain, and for how long can you retain? And what about management pieces? I mean, how does that work? Lots it being interplayed within the data minimization practice that we consider as privacy professionals in industry. So what does it mean to operationalize it in practice? Sure, I've talked about it in terms of what the benefits are, how it is a great tool to protect one's privacy. But firstly, why do we do it more so, and how do we do it? So we do it, practically speaking, also to reduce storage costs. As you know, there are data centers proliferating all across the planet. It costs a lot of money to run them. It costs a lot by way of injury that's done to the climate, i.e., the amount of cooling that's required of data centers to run them. So from that perspective, it's a benefit if we minimize the amount of data we collect. It also helps improve compliance with different regulation standards and laws around the world. And essentially, in the healthcare setting specifically, it reduces risks. So if you are not holding on to so much data, you're reducing the risk of nefarious cyber attacks of that data. As you know, across healthcare industries all over the world, hospitals and whatnot, cyber attacks have just exponentially proliferated for many, many reasons, which is a different talk of its own. But if you're holding to not as much data, only the data that you need, then you minimize that security risk as well, right? And you reduce that surface attack or attack surface. So hence, the principle is collect and store the minimal amount that you need, collect and store only for the purpose that you need and not any other secondary purpose. And if you're going to go and use it for that data for secondary purpose, pause. You have to go back to the users, the providers of that data, and get consent again, hence the complicated consent management piece. But that is fundamental to the use of data, that the data that's being used is for that purpose that it was collected, that it was consented to only. Also, very important part of data minimization. And at the end of the day, as far as an organization is concerned, corporations are concerned, what they do is they foster trust of their customers by showing that they're practicing in a transparent way. As in today's day and age, we're seeing a lot of trust fall through the cracks for corporations who are practicing in terms of collecting data. And give me a company that's not collecting data, right? It's just happening everywhere. So it's becoming very, very important that the most important currency that a company has right now, other than data, is trust of their customer. And if they lose that trust, the entire company falls apart. I mean, look at what happened to Cambridge Analytica, right? After all that data leaked, that company went under, and Facebook suffered some serious reputational damage because of that one particular practice. And it's not that it stopped happening, it's still happening. It's a matter of whether they get caught doing this or not. But we as consumers, as providers of that data, should be aware that this is happening. So I've discussed a bit about the importance of data minimization. I've just provided some more detail on this. I've given Adam my slide deck for those who want to read it some more at your own time. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but discussed all of these at a high level. Well, I welcome you to look at the slide deck later. So in terms of operationalizing, in terms of the actual practice of data minimization, when you are working in the realm of in the space of data and knowing where you all are right now studying at CMU, you're already looking at it. And when you get out into the industry, more than likely you will be in this space. You will have to conduct inventory of data, meaning go discover data. There are many tools available in the industry to help us do this. Map the data, figure out where it's sitting in the corporation, be able to label it, tag it such that you know what the nature of that data is, know what's PII versus PI versus basically benign data, and then do data lineage mapping. Again, lots of wonderful tools in the industry that help us do that. I'm not going to name the tools because I don't want to seem like I'm supporting one over the other, but lots available. That leads us to defining the data. So once we have categorized, classified data, then we can put it in different buckets and say, it's basically explain and justify why we're collecting that data, what the purpose is, so such that we are audited by the FTC's different regulatory bodies of the world, we can justify why we're holding on to that data. But we need to know what the nature of it is. We need to know where it's located and how it's categorized and classified. when working for, and I've worked for both private and public sector, when working for these companies that collect data, it's very, very important that we have internal policies and procedures that we comply with to minimize data collection. If we have policies and procedures in place, which are critical, working right alongside engineering, then only then can your front end, back end folks know what it means to minimize data collection. And data collection just doesn't happen at the collection stage, it happens at the storage stage, processing stage, input output stages. So it's a practice all across the data life cycle. But the policies and procedures have to spell out and explain to employees as to what that means and how they can operationalize it within their practice. And then there's the educational piece of data minimization as well. Like I'm talking about it right now. It's very important to socialize it throughout the culture of the corporation, both laterally and vertically. And this is why privacy engineering is so important. So proud to call myself a privacy engineer because we sit at that intersection of legal, policy, engineering, architecture, communications, marketing. We're able to talk all these languages and communicate this messaging all across the board, laterally and vertically. This profession is becoming so critical because essentially what it's doing is breaking the silos that different professions are working within the industry and bringing them to a round table and perpetuating this dialogue forward such that everybody can understand, for example, what the term data minimization means and not as create their own scenarios of it. And this is why privacy engineering is becoming such a critical profession. And I'm happy to say that, especially in the tech industry, this profession is being recognized. Jobs are out there for it, and there are proper job descriptions now that are coming out. A little bit of growing pains in terms of the job descriptions, but it's happening. The IAPP, for example, has a full advisory body that's guiding industry as to how to write these role descriptions, which is amazing. So going back to operationalizing, then there's a whole monitoring piece of data collection, processing, retention, deletion, archiving, purging. All these are very important steps. As you know, in GDPR, EU citizens have the right to request their data to be deleted, to the right to be forgotten, it's called. The minute that happens, when an EU citizen puts that request in, and if you are one of the big tech companies, say one of the FANGs, and your data is flowing throughout the planet, you are obligated under GDPR to delete that person's data. And you've got 30 days to do it, and you're going to do it from your backup, your archive, wherever you've got data duplication happening, you've got to go find it and then delete it and get back to the requester and give them that assurance. Now, how do you do it if you haven't assessed and conducted inventory of your data and haven't categorized it, classified it, cataloged it, and know which buckets it's sitting in within your cloud or on-prem and whatnot, right? So it goes back to the first step of assessing, defining, and then implementing, educating. Then there's the monitoring. And then remember, there are bodies out there that will come and audit you just to make sure you're complying with the laws. And if you're not, FTC has been pretty punitive, same with the EU courts in terms of the fines that they're throwing down on different companies, and they are huge fines. With regards to LLM tooling, they're actually using, FTC is using a measure called algorithmic disgorgement, where they are requiring companies to not only get rid of all the data that they've been storing unlawfully and using, but also to delete the entire algorithm, the entire LLM tooling, which is a huge pain point for a lot of companies, as you can imagine. And then the last step to operationalizing data minimization is to improve the process continually. It's iterative, it's not set in stone, it's a very dynamic process. And it's for the betterment of the company if they are constantly evolving that process. This brings us to the methodology of what are some of the techniques that we can use to actually look at the data that we do have and say it's been categorized and classified as highly sensitive, but needs to be used, for example, for analytics. What are some of the processes we can use? And this is where we come to either we can de-identify that data by introducing masking techniques, redact it, pseudonymize it, anonymize it, also implement differential privacy where you're introducing noise in the data sets, so using different epsilon values to enact that. That one being the most difficult of all the processes. Anonymizing, pseudonymizing being some of the more doable ones. The benefit of anonymizing, which is why I've highlighted, is because once you anonymize data, it's not subject to any laws and regulations anymore. Because the idea is that you cannot re-identify a subject, a user, a consumer through that processes. Where pseudonymize, you can still re-identify the person. So it is still subject to law. Anonymizing data has that benefit, but it can also have the downside of it losing its data utility. So there's a fine balance that companies have to play with to anonymize data. And there are many, many techniques out there. I'm not going to get into that right now. That's a completely different talk and can go on for hours, but that's an amazing technique to do. A lot of companies are anonymizing data for that purpose, especially in the healthcare and the health tech and fintech industries where you're dealing with highly, highly sensitive information. So what does that anonymizing data mean? If we just look at that, or pseudonymizing data, essentially what you're trying to do with anonymized data specifically is you are equating that data to be not personal data anymore, not to be classified as such. So it's no longer PII, it's no longer PI, so that has the bandwidth, the green light to be used for processing and for being consumed in your LLM tooling, your different machine learning processes, so that analytics can be drawn for whatever the purpose is for data to be utilized. It could be for marketing purposes, right? It could be to push out different scenarios in the shopping space, for example. So you're buying shoes, your data could be used just to push out different brands of shoes to you. So many purposes for it. But it's very important that as you are being as ads are being pushed to you, that you're not being re-identified in that process as an individual. That's a huge problem that the EU courts especially are concerned with, hence recital 26 of GDPR that brings so much attention to anonymized data. If you can satisfy the auditors that your data is properly anonymized, then you are no longer subject to GDPR and a lot of other rules and regulations around the world. So in America, for example, the CCPA, being the guiding light in that arena. I've just covered that, since it is considered to be information that is not re-identifiable, hence it's not subject to law. So I'll just move on along with that. Let's look at some of the privacy laws and standards that are driving all of this, right? I have to say that it's very hard for laws, regulations, standards such as NIST, ISOs to keep up with the speed at which technological advancements are happening. It's nearly impossible. Sitting in Canada, for example, our legislators were trying to create something similar to the AI Act in the US. It's called IDA, and it's just fallen through the cracks because I think we need, beyond regulators, we need engineers, we need technologists to sit at the table as well. So, for example, in our parliament, to write these acts so that they're dynamic and can iteratively accommodate the changing technological ecosystem that we are faced in this world today. And it's just very difficult to do. But what happens as a result, you've got the Wild Wild West, where you've got companies that can create any kind of LLM tooling that they want because there aren't regulations that are preventing them from doing it. So it's a huge loophole within the regulatory landscape. But in GDP, the GDPR in the EU, as we discussed, is the guiding light for the entire planet. All the global laws and regulations are mimicking after the GDPR, which is great. Your 10 key principles are guiding all laws. The AI Act in the EU is also another robust piece of legislation that's gone through, which is also driving that conversation. In the US, you've got the AI Bill of Rights, the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which is very, very important. California is leading the way through and through with the CCPA, CPRA, and now you've got 12 other states that have fallen through. I haven't known them all. We've got federal privacy laws in the US for health, financial education, children's protection. So you've got COPPA, you've got HIPAA, you've got the Gramm-Lee one. These are very important for us engineers. All these laws and regulations are very important for us engineers to put under our belt. We cannot just work in silos. We cannot just work in our own operationalized fields without being mindful of these laws and regulations. It's critical that we, alongside legal, if we're sitting in a corporation, know how compliance against these laws and regulations work. That's what's driving businesses nowadays. Compliance with the GDPR alone, as you know, is critical. It came into force May 25th, 2018. Since then, it's been a robust force everywhere, especially in the EU. It's to the point that you even have to be so nuanced as to look at how is data flowing from the 27 states that make up the EU into the UK, which, as you know, is not part of the EU anymore, or any of the other states that are not part of the EU, because now they're even though they're in the European continent, they are not considered part of the EU, not part of the Union, right? So different set of laws apply there. So if you're one of the FANG companies, you're working, an engineer working there, you have to look at how data is flowing between the data stores in the different countries and what laws and regulations apply there. As technologists, we need to be very, very mindful of it. I can't stress that point enough. It affects the entire company immensely. Hence, I think that it's becoming very critical for universities, colleges, private vendors who are offering education in privacy, cybersecurity, privacy engineering to bring in components of law, regulation, standards alongside studying the operationalizing of these principles. We can't work in silos anymore. It's just not tenable. And I've already touched upon the enforcement of data minimization. The practice is recognized under different jurisdictions all around the world. Less data is better. It's better for governance. It's better for the operations of the company. It's better from compliance perspective, from trust perspective of making sure you are able to maintain your customer base. But it's one that is not easy to practice in a company setting, unfortunately, but one that companies don't have a choice but to be mindful of and to operationalize very intentfully, very meaningfully within their ecosystems. So I've given you a very high level understanding of what the practice of data minimization is and what it means to pseudonymize, anonymize data. I can't stress it enough, working in the industry, both from the public and private sector perspective, as to how critical this practice is, along with some other principles. There's a lot more that we could discuss within the privacy spectrum, and I just want to open it up for questions and comments for anyone that may have.
Thank you, Saima. I think we have a few questions in the chat already.
Sure.
So one is kind of a regulatory question. Does Canada have an equivalent to HIPAA for U.S. Or HIPAA is the U.S. health data law, really?
Right. Yeah. Yes. A very, very good question. We don't have a federal health law. We have them in every province. So I'm sitting in the province of Ontario, which is where Toronto's located. We have something called PHIPAA, which is an equivalent of HIPAA, but regulating all health data within our province, which is the piece of legislation that myself working at Ontario Health, I have to be fluent in and know how to comply with when managing the health data of Ontarians.
Yeah, kind of expanding on that question, could you speak to the regulatory landscape in Canada more generally? Is it more sectoral like the US, or I know there's efforts to do more comprehensive bills as well?
Yes, definitely. So we actually have a federal privacy piece of legislation, which America doesn't, and I know that's in the works. When it will happen is the big question. I think still a ways to go. But similar to your state by state, the patchwork type situation, we have that as well. So we've got 10 provinces and 2 territories, and each province has both private and public sector privacy laws and health ones as well, which are separate. And then we've got our guiding principles, the federal law, which is called PIPEDA, which is undergoing some revamping, and it's gone through second reading in Parliament, and we're going to have a robust new piece of federal law probably by 2025, which is so badly needed because PIPEDA right now, which is our federal piece of law, was created before the internet became ubiquitous in every household. So we badly need this upgrade, but unfortunately, we will not have artificial intelligence-based regulation anytime soon. So are there any industry standards for anonymization? A company could barely anonymize the data and avoid regulation. Yes, there are. NIST is one standardization body that offers that kind of guidance, and theirs is quite robust. Like I was saying, these things need to be taught alongside engineering, privacy engineering principles in universities. NIST has it, ISO has them. Unfortunately, they're standards and not regulations. I touched upon this. Regulations in the AI sector are lagging throughout the planet only because artificial intelligence tools are developing at such a rapid rate. It's very difficult for regulators to keep up with the advancement of these technologies because A, they don't understand it, B, they are having trouble keeping up with pace. That's why I feel that we need engineers, scientists working within the regulatory space to help regulators generate these laws, write them in a very iterative, evolving way. It's starting to happen, but it's not fast enough, unfortunately.
Okay. As a follow-on, there's a question whether achieving anonymization or pseudonymization means kind of achieving some level of K-anonymity, L diversity, or T closeness, or are there kind of some alignment to best practices that organizations can kind of measure against? Like, yeah, how do we measure kind of whether data is sufficiently anonymized?
Yeah, so it depends. A really good question. Depends on the technique you're using to exact anonymization, pseudonymization. So with K-anonymity, I've seen numbers anywhere from 5 to 100. It's ridiculous. The range is ridiculous as to what can be considered as the norm. Reason being, we've got such a diversified data sets out there. And there's so many data quality issues that they were dealing with. So this is such an evolving space from a research perspective and a practice perspective. Industry-wide, there is no consensus on what the right K-anonymity number is or the others, unfortunately. I went to the Pepper conference last year, the privacy engineering conference in Santa Clara, the San Jose area. And this is ongoing work that a lot of presenters from Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, CMU as well presented on. And this is ongoing discussion. So definitely something to keep a close eye on and constantly learn about. I'm hoping we'll eventually arrive at a standard, but we're not there yet.
Yeah. So I guess kind of a related question is, given kind of the advancements in AI capabilities, it's becoming increasingly difficult to truly anonymize data anymore. Do you have any kind of further insights related to that, or do you have any further comments?
You're right, it is difficult to anonymize data from the perspective of data utility because what's happening, which is something that we in the industry are struggling with a lot, is that you successfully anonymize data, but now you lose data utility. Now you can't extract data analytics or proper analytics out of that data, right? It is one that is a struggle. There are a lot of amazing startups in the industry who are working with synthetic data to see if they can bypass anonymizing data related problems. Sometimes there's a conjunction of both solutions working together. There's a lot out there, but we have not come to a solution that is the go-to yet. It's still quite an evolving process. partially because of the nature of data that's flowing into platforms of a lot of companies. If you look at some of the big technology companies, I mean, they'll tell you, we don't even know where our data is sitting. That's part of the problem, right? Let alone the nature of the data, the amount of noise in the data, the quality of the data. There's a lot of, you've heard the term GIGA, right? Garbage in, garbage out. There's a lot of garbage data sitting out there. So the answer to the question is, I don't have an answer, a proper answer, because it's such a complicated space. But the good news is that there are companies out there, a lot of startups out there making quite a bit of headway. And I'm really excited to go to the Pepper conference in June this year as well to see some of the newer technologies that are out in this space. Hope to report back one day on this soon.
Okay, and there's another question related to some of the enforcement actions that you mentioned, which involves actually deleting the model and as well as the associated data. Do you imagine kind of newer research techniques like unlearning playing a role in these decisions?
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating area. Again, another one that is being researched, worked on heavily, but until then, the FTC's decided algorithmic disgorgement is the punitive damage they are going to resort to. And boy, have been hammering down hard. And that's enough to wipe out a company. Once that company's been ordered, and there've been quite a few, especially those that are in the surveillance industry and biometric surveillance, there's quite a bit of surveillance companies that are infiltrating the healthcare market, the financial market, both in the US and Canada. It's happening everywhere. In the policing market, right? In that space, there's a lot of, as a result, discrimination happening against people of minority background, where you've got data that's been selectively used to create these tools to surveil those who are of vulnerable community backgrounds, and the FTC is not having it, which is great. But what they're doing is doing a broad stroke punitive measure, which is basically get rid of your algorithm, get rid of your tool, get rid of all the data that you fed into it. Boom, company done, finished. We're not there yet where you can do reverse learning and perhaps not destroy a company in the process. But up to that point, this is the tool that they're going to use, or the measure they're going to use.
And then I think kind of going back to the trade-offs that you mentioned, utility versus privacy, someone made the comment that anonymization gets a bit more complicated when we're thinking about public sector benefits like national security, maybe disease monitoring and things like that. You have kind of, I guess, additional thoughts related to that, given that you work in the health space.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's a really good question, actually. It's interesting. A lot of regulations and laws that are designed with government being exempt in this area, and certain security related folks being exempt as well, especially when it comes to protecting national security. Those rules don't apply. And there's a lot of outcry about it too, because as you can imagine, that leaves a lot of room for abuse, both by governments and by security forces such as police and secret police and whatnot. That's how that's being handled, and it's so they say for the good of the public and at large. That makes sense, right? That you should be able to bypass the regulations so that national security can be maintained. Unfortunately, that's the only way we have right now to handle that scenario, is to exempt all of them from following these laws and regulations and standards. And whether accountability happens or not, that's nuanced. That's based on every country. In a lot of countries, governments are not held accountable for their actions. They actually have a free pass in this area under that argument.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I guess I hadn't really considered that perspective before.
Yeah, for every upside, there's a downside, right? I mean, at face value, governments should have this available to them, right? Because they have to protect the welfare of the public. But how far can that go? And if it's such a broad stroke exempt green card for them, then what are the nuanced violations that can happen, that do happen? And then why isn't accountability there for them? They should be held accountable as well. So these are ongoing struggles that that have to be surfaced and dealt with. But there's just so much going on in the technology space, just in trying to keep up with the nature of the data that's flowing onto different platforms and dealing with that it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And with AI in the mix, it is quite a daunting task in dealing with that. And bringing in philosophical arguments such as dealing with discrimination, algorithmic discrimination that's happening. I put a post up recently on LinkedIn, and I do welcome all of you to please reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. Is so important to see who's coding, what are they coding, why are they coding what they're coding. We're not holding people accountable. Also, we're not holding accountable folks who are feeding data into these systems, right? There was a study out of the University of Chicago some time ago where in the cardiac department of the hospital, they noticed that a lot of Black, brown men were passing away of heart attacks at a higher rate than white men were. Well, they looked at the algorithm that was generating as to the queue, as to who was next to get their heart surgery. More often than not, it was the white men who got them first, and women were discriminated against too. It didn't matter what ethnic background they were in. And they realized that the coding was done as such, and the data was fed as such that it prioritized white men above all others. And when you put that kind of information into artificial intelligence, into different tools that you're using, that problem is not linear or even binary. It's actually exponential. It just proliferates and toxifies the entire system. In this case, the entire cardiac part of the hospital, right? We need to be aware of this as technologists, as engineers, that power is in our hand, and we need to hold ourselves accountable and those around us who are either coding, developing systems, working in data pipelines, software development pipelines. I mean, these are very important philosophical considerations we need to contend with.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a powerful note to end on. Do we have any other questions here in the room? No? Okay, maybe we can do one last round of applause for our speaker.